want to know whether God exists, and if God does exist, what such a supreme being could possibly be like. How to examine such questions about God, be they positive, there is a God, or negative, there is no God. I love philosophy because philosophy forces me to think in a disciplined manner. And when philosophy focuses on questions about God, the discipline is called philosophy of religion. But why is philosophy of religion so controversial, so divisive? Can philosophy of religion find God? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. I'm haunted by questions about God. Does God exist? What is God like? How does God act? That's why I enjoy philosophy of religion, but it's daunting. How to grasp its ideas, ways of thinking. With trepidation, I reach for the top, a leading philosopher of religion who energized Christian philosophy. I go to Notre Dame to meet Alvin Plantinga. I prepare feverishly. I am intimidated, nervous too. I try not to show it. Al, in my quest, I have been absolutely entranced by the role of philosophy in illuminating religion. However, I have friends who are believers in diverse religions who would look upon philosophy as something that is almost over-intellectualizing and therefore trivializing religion.
I can understand why people think that about philosophy, but the fact is I think philosophy is extremely useful for serious believers in God. In the first place, it can help one understand how one's religious beliefs, how belief in God, for example, is related to the rest of what you believe. How are you going to put, let's say, what you think about science together with what you think about God? That's, of course, a philosophical question. There have been lots of arguments thrown up, lots of objections to theistic belief or Christian belief. And it's the role of philosophy in the Christian community to look at these arguments and see if there is anything to them and respond to them.
What are some examples?
Well, the argument from evil, the claim that it can't be true both that there is such a person as God, who is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good, and also evil, suffering, pain. There's also the suggestion that whether or not theistic belief is true, it's not rational or reasonable or sensible or justified or intellectually up to snuff in some way or other. There's something defective about it. There is this claim that believing in God isn't proper or acceptable because there isn't sufficient evidence for it.
Right.
The arguments for the existence of God, they say, aren't cogent. They don't really show that there is such a person as God. Even if they make it sort of probable, they don't support the belief sufficiently so that you can actually believe it, as opposed to saying, yeah, it could be, it's pretty likely.
Yeah.
And here I think philosophy has got something very sensible to say about this.
How have you developed that thought?
Well, there are lots of beliefs we hold such that you can't hold them sensibly without having an argument or evidence for them. For example, suppose I believed that the first person to cross the landmass from Asia to North America was left-handed. It would be silly to believe that without having any reason or any evidence for it. But other things we all believe without having argument or evidence. For example, that there are other people. I see you sitting here. Here's this body before me looking various ways and so on. And I, without even thinking, assume that there's a person here, somebody who thinks things, has feelings, who has beliefs, and so on. I do this automatically. I don't give an argument. So some beliefs are such that you have to have evidence for them to be rational or reasonable or sensible. Other beliefs are such that you don't have to have. And now the question is, which of these two groups does belief in God fall into?
Right.
Lots of people have just automatically assumed that you can't properly believe in God unless you know of such arguments or unless there are some good arguments. But why think that? Maybe belief in God is like belief in other minds or belief in the past. If God has in fact created us, maybe he's hardwired into us not only belief in the past and in other minds, but also belief in God, which would explain the fact that the vast majority of the world's population does believe in God or something like God. I mean, it's not as if, let's say, the natural human condition is that of the skeptic who says, well, prove to me that God exists, then maybe I'll believe. Natural human condition involves taking it for granted or automatically believing, or at any rate coming to believe that there is a person like God or something like God.
One could say that the fact that you want to put God in the category of believing without argument is motivated by the fact that the arguments that you have are weak.
Could say that. Could say the same thing about other minds. Arguments there are pretty weak too. One question to ask is, well, what do they think is wrong with you if you believe in God but you don't have arguments or evidence?
Right.
Here there are three possibilities. The first is that you're being irresponsible and you're not living up to your intellectual obligations if you believe in such a thing as God without having a good argument.
Right.
That doesn't seem to me to be much of a decent argument. If you have a duty to do something, and then if you don't do it, you're culpable in some way, it must be that it was up to you whether you do that thing or not. But that isn't the way it is with our beliefs for the most part. If I thought I was, say, 30 years younger and very handsome, I'd probably be a lot happier. But that's not how it works with us. Belief in God, for my guess is, most people is like that too. It's something voluntarily adopted and can be voluntarily got rid of. Mm-hmm. So if belief in God isn't really up to me, so to speak, within my power to believe or not believe, then I can hardly be going contrary to some duty in fact, believing.
Second argument.
The second suggestion is that you're being irrational. Mm-hmm. Now, what is irrationality? So you're being rational, you're believing rationally when your reason, when your mind, your intellect is functioning properly. There isn't any sort of dysfunction. Maybe you can have fixed ideas, for example. You find yourself fixated on some thought. You think it over and over again. That's irrational. Well, what about belief in God without an argument? Is that irrational in that way? Surely not. Again, most of the world's population believes in God or something like God, and the vast majority of those people don't believe on the basis of arguments. So it's not irrational either. I've said there are these three possibilities. The third one is this. It might be that belief in God lacks that property, enough of which is what separates knowledge from a lucky guess, from a mere true belief. So suppose I believe that the Yankees will win the pennant and win the World Series this year, despite the fact that right now they're in last place. Now, it might turn out that I'm right. It's not that now I know that they will. I just guessed and I was lucky. So the difference between knowledge and a lucky guess or a mere true belief, that's, we could use the term warrant to refer to that difference, such that when you've got enough of it for a given belief, then that belief is something you know, as opposed to merely just believing. Well, now it might be that the suggestion is belief in God, when accepted not on the basis of evidence, but in that basic way, doesn't have warrant. And here we'd want to ask them, well, what exactly is warrant? What distinguishes a warranted belief, a belief that constitutes knowledge, from mere true belief, is that it's been produced in me or in you by cognitive faculties that are functioning properly in the kind of environment for which they were designed by God or evolution or both, according to a design plan that is successfully aimed at truth. Okay, so suppose now we ask, well, does belief in God have warrant? I think you have to consider the following. Suppose there really is such a person as God. Well, and suppose, as theism says, he's created us in his image, then he would almost certainly want us to be able to know about him. So belief in God would almost certainly be designed into us by God. It would be part of our design plan. So if, in fact, belief in God is true, if there really is such a person as God, then in all likelihood, it's also warranted.
And if God doesn't exist?
And if God doesn't exist, then very likely it's not produced in us by cognitive faculties functioning properly according to a design plan aimed at truth, because of course it's not true if God doesn't exist. So that particular part of our design plan wouldn't be aimed at truth, and hence belief in God would not be warranted if God doesn't exist.
Now, whereas this can sound to be circular in its thinking, it is not, because what we're dealing with is a justification for our belief in God. So we're dealing not with the subject of whether God exists or not, but whether it's rational, justified, and appropriate.
Right, there are two questions. One is whether belief in God is true, and two is whether belief in God has warrant. And these are quite different questions. So it's not really, as you say, it's not really circular, but it is true that belief in God has warrant if and only if it's true. Because if God really does exist, then belief in God almost certainly, very probably does have warrant. And hence one can't sensibly argue that belief in God doesn't have warrant without first showing that there isn't any such person as God. Who can know a thing like that?
This is Al's revolutionary argument, which turns traditional arguments about God upside down. Justifying belief in God without the old discredited proofs of God. Warrant, or true belief, for believing in God, Al says, is based on God's existence. Thus, the only way to know that belief in God does not have warrant is to know that God does not exist. But we cannot know that God does not exist. Therefore, Al concludes, it is justified to believe in God. What? Circular reasoning and thus invalid? Al's argument does seem to revolve in circles. Then, slowly, the fog lifts, and I start to see Al's startling point. There are two different questions here. Does God really exist? And is it justified to believe in God? But am I seeing a mirage? My cognition twisted by my emotions? I'm confused, but I now appreciate the power of philosophy of religion. But I need more. Another way of thinking, another personality. I meet a philosopher known for explaining how God relates to time and how to save God from the problem of evil, Eleonore Stump.
Here's the way to think about philosophy of religion. At the ultimate foundation of all reality, according to the major monotheisms, is something that has a mind and a will. That means God is a person. Anything with mind and will, in our sense of the word, is a person. Okay. If at the ultimate foundation of all reality is a person, then you gotta know a person face to face, person to person, or really don't know him at all. You've gotta experience God, see? So think about it this way. One time, my son called me up and he said to me, "Mom," he said, "I've met someone and you need to like her." So I'm on high alert, and I say, "Tell me about her." That's the philosophy of religion part, see? And I want to hear as much as I can hear about her, you know, what she do, what she like. When all is said and done, however, until I actually meet her, I haven't really got what I want by way of knowing her. So what I want to say is these streams are complementary to each other. Philosophy of religion is the tell me about her part. And that gives you stuff which is wonderful, deep, enriching. But at the end, what the psalmist says is, taste and see that God is good. And you got to have that part too. So here's another way to think about the whole issue. In the 13th century, a very learned Dominican came to see Francis. And he had a passage in the Bible that was worrying him. Here's the passage. God says to the prophet Ezekiel, he says, "You know, if you don't warn sinners about their sin, I'm going to hold you personally responsible, and I'm going to give you the punishment their evils deserve. So the Dominican, the very learned Dominican said, Father Francis, a lot of people who do morally bad things come across my path, but I don't really rebuke them. Is God going to hold me responsible for all that stuff? So you can see the Dominican's problem. You're supposed to say, hey, wait a minute. You know, that thing you're doing there, that's a morally wrong act. And I can show you why it is. I reason it out, and here's the arguments and premises and stuff. And you can see why that would make life kind of difficult for him and why he wouldn't want to do it. So Francis said to the learned Dominican, if you are a servant of God's, your life ought to be on fire with love. Love for God, love for the good. And that fire of love will set a standard by which anybody can measure his own shortcomings and moral wrongdoings. So now what you can see is two radically different ways of thinking. One way is to say, okay, we need principles, premises, arguments. That's how we're going to get our ethics done, our metaphysics and so on. But in the story, Francis's idea is this. No, you need iconic, exemplar people, persons, who show you something that you couldn't get out of the premises. And both of these streams are useful for us.
Eleonore has two roads to get to God, the analytical and the experiential, the rational and the emotional. Me? I guess I'm handicapped. I have only one. I rely on analysis, but I distrust feelings. If philosophy of religion has universal import, it must also work with religions that are not Christian. I should learn something about my own heritage. I go to New York to meet a Jewish philosopher at Yeshiva University, Rabbi David Shatz.
The two types of philosophy, the two different avenues to studying religion, have been, first of all, what would roughly be called the analytic school, which is very common in America. In England, this is all the rage there primarily. The other is through kind of continental philosophy, European philosophy, which deals with questions more about the inner life of the believer. What is the psyche of the believer when he prays, when he has an experience of the holy? Religious phenomenology is basically what it is. What analytic philosophy does is really two things primarily. First of all, it clarifies a lot of religious concepts. You have concepts like, God's being omniscient, God's being omnipotent, he's all powerful, all-knowing, knows everything, can do everything, is all good. And there's a lot of clarification that's needed of those concepts, particularly since some of them actually conflict with other sorts of religious doctrines. Also, some people who've worked in this area of clarifying concepts have found that there's a certain distance that it creates between biblically based religion and sort of philosophically based religion. I think the best example of this is the concept of God not having emotions. You look at the Bible, God has a great deal of personality. God gets angry, God gets sad, sometimes he's furious, and it portrays God as a personality. Then you get to philosophy, and philosophy tells you God can't have emotions. Because when someone has emotions, it would be an imperfection because he changes. That concept doesn't really mesh with the biblical. Philosophers are becoming very conscious of this gap, and they're raising a lot of questions as to whether the attributes and the concepts that they introduce in trying to describe God are really ones that they need. The second function, besides clarifying concepts, is trying to prove the existence of God. In the Jewish tradition, there was a lot of work done on trying to prove the existence of God. So much so that a number of Jewish philosophers believed that it is a religious obligation to study philosophy. So much so that Maimonides actually includes this in the mitzvah or commandment to study Torah, Talmud Torah. For Maimonides, the activity of proving what the world is like and thinking about God is itself going to lead to the love of God. A lot of philosophers question this, most notably Judah Halevi, who actually died before Maimonides wrote, But Halevi believed that reason cools the passions, right? That you're not going to get love out of the existence of God. What you're going to do is get an abstractness, and you're going to study God the way in which the astronomer studies the stars, where he couldn't care less whether he turns out he had the wrong theory one day. And Halevi believes you can't have love of God this way. You can come to the idea of a creator, but not the idea of a personal God. Still, this notion of philosophy as a religious obligation is tied up with the idea of love of God. The second thing that I think made philosophy valuable, it comes in a little small comment that's made by Sa'adja Gaon, where he says, we study philosophy for a number of reasons. One of them is to answer the heretic, and the other, he says, is to make it a matter of actual knowledge to us. Suppose you have a math problem, and you're trying to work on the solution and you can't quite solve it. You go to the back of the book, where they have the answers to those, and the answer is the square root of 37. Well, you now know that the answer to that problem is the square root of 37. But in another sense, you don't really know it. You don't understand what the justification is. You're not placing it in the context of other things that you know. And I think this is what Sa'adja means when he talks about the idea of making the knowledge of the existence of God a matter of actual knowledge to us.
David sees more complementarity than conflict in philosophy of religion. Biblically based religion, he says, does not contradict philosophically based religion. David protects his own worldview. I hope he's right. I can despair over philosophy. There seems an inverse relationship between progress and meaningfulness. That which makes progress is not meaningful, and that which is meaningful makes no progress. Perhaps too many believers make me weary. Perhaps I should speak with a philosopher of religion who is an atheist. I meet Michael Tooley. Michael, can philosophy illuminate religion?
Yeah, I think it can. I mean, philosophy goes back to Socrates and the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. And out of that sort of Socratic start, you have this idea that it's important to subject your most basic beliefs and values and so on to really careful, critical scrutiny, right? And I think that if a religious believer does that, that he or she will then move on either to a more satisfying formulation of the basic religious outlook they have, a formulation that avoids certain problems and objections and so on, or alternatively, of course, they may decide to give up the religion that they have. But in either case, either one has moved on to a different view that one thinks is intellectually more satisfying, more likely to be true, or one has refined the view that one started with and arrived at a better formulation of it. A lot of philosophers share the view put forward by the great Scottish philosopher David Hume. Hume said that the wise man, one might add the wise woman, proportions his or her belief to the evidence, right? On contrast, in the case of religion, there's often emphasis upon faith. That's sometimes interpreted to mean that it's a good thing to believe things, even if there isn't very strong evidential support for it. So one of the things that one can get from philosophy if one is religious is just this question: is faith a good thing or not? Or should I try to arrive at religious beliefs that are well supported by the evidence? I think one should also take the view that there could be experiences, other than sensory experiences, that do have evidential value. But the idea, again, would be that you don't simply assume that if you, for example, have an experience of God, then it follows, of course, that there's good reason to believe in the existence of God, right? You have to take a critical...
Could be a seizure in your temporal lobe.
That's right, yeah, or belief you absorb from your environment, your family, and so on. So the idea is that you don't, so to speak, begin by excluding any experiences, but neither do you assume that certain experiences, of course, justified grounds for accepting given belief. You look at that carefully using the methods you use to look at any other sorts of experiences.
I love philosophy of religion, proofs and disproofs of God, attributes of God, alternative beliefs about God, the problem of evil, the varieties of religious experience, science and religion. I appreciate philosophers of religion, be they theists or atheists, because they contribute to religious understanding. because they clarify religious issues. I reject the objection that philosophical thinking will reduce one's religious fervor. Unless, of course, there is no reality behind the fervor. And then, well, good riddance to false fervor. Some say I should submit to God, experience God in my heart. Or that belief in God is so basic I need no justification to believe. I respect those who say they know God, or who give license to believe without evidence or argument. But those ways are not my ways. I may be wrong, getting closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.